Okay, let's continue where we left off. Gregory was born about 540 into an old and wealthy senatorial family of Rome and was educated for governmental service. In his childhood, control of Rome changed hands numerous times. At age 33, the Emperor Justin appointed him prefect or mayor of Rome, the highest civil position in the city and its surrounding territory. He became responsible for the whole economy of Rome. Gregory was never comfortable with worldly power, however, as he preferred the solitude of the monastery. Within a few years, he stepped down from public office. He stepped down from public office to move away from worldly life. He spent the greater part of his personal fortune in founding 7 monasteries, giving away the rest as alms for the poor. He lived as a monk and practiced extraordinary asceticism, uh, meaning very strict disciplines, such as eating only raw fruits and vegetables and praying most of the night. However, his talents could not remain hidden. In 579, Pope Pelagius II made him a deacon of the Roman Church and sent him as ambassador to the imperial court in Constantinople. His political training and executive ability fitted him for this position. Upon his return, he was appointed abbot of his convent, though he still conducted important public business. He was perfectly content to be an abbot and would have continued in the monastic life if the plague had not led to the death of Pope Pelagius II. Let's look at picking up the pieces of a shattered world. Soon after Gregory's election, the Lombards laid siege to Rome, and the new pope was forced to cut short his preaching. All of Western Europe was in chaos. Serious men, including Gregory, thought that the end of the world was at hand. Though the Church of Rome survived the attacks, it was almost the only trace of organized civilization in the West that did so. Gregory devoted himself to the struggle for order in the midst of chaos. He wrote urgent letters to the managers of his estates in Sicily, began a vast correspondence with his bishops, and set forth the principles of Christian ministry in his writing. The prestige of the papacy in the Middle Ages is in large part due to the practical government maintained by Gregory through these troubled times. During Gregory's time, the Church of Rome controlled extensive lands around Rome. These estates, which amounted to about 1,800 square miles, made the church the richest landowner in Italy. Thus, when the Lombards invaded Italy and destroyed the imperial administration, the church administration, headed by Gregory, stepped in to feed the population and collect land taxes. Moreover, when Lombard attacks moved closer to Rome, Gregory undertook the defense of central Italy, appointing a military governor and arranging peace with 2 Lombard leaders. The participation in the political fortunes of Italy became a significant element for the papal office in the centuries that followed. After Gregory, the Pope was no longer only a Christian leader, but an important political figure in European politics. Gregory's leadership increased the authority of the papal office. In a clash with John IV, Patriarch of Constantinople, Gregory was provoked and irritated by John's use of the honorary title Universal Bishop, which the emperors Leo and Justinian had given to patriarchs. Gregory sought to get this title revoked, feeling it was presumptuous. In opposition to such high sounding titles, He called himself simply the servant of the servants of God. While he protested titles he claimed and exercised, as far as he had the opportunity, oversight over the whole Church of Christ, which eventually led his successors to use even more arrogant titles. Gregory saw pride as a vicious hound that pursued him relentlessly. However, it is clear that he was susceptible to it. All his vigorous activity and determination seemed to spring from his knowledge of his own pride and attempt to overcome this evil in himself. Let's look at missionary statesmen. With Gregory, monasticism came to the papal throne for the first time, as he was the first monk to become pope. He continued the extreme simplicity of monastic life, surrounded himself with monks, made them bishops and ambassadors, confirmed the rule of Saint Benedict, guaranteed the liberty and property of convents, and by his example and influence gave the highest service to the monastic life. One story, which is likely partly fictional, tells of Gregory becoming, or before becoming pope, discovering 3 young English boys for sale in the Roman marketplace and lamented that they had no knowledge of God. Using wordplays such as describing these young angels as having the appearance of angels, he recognized the need for mission in England. Though he attempted to go himself as a missionary monk, he was unable to do so. But once he became pope, he sent Augustine of Canterbury and 40 monks to take the gospel to England, ultimately providing a link for all Anglo-American Christianity with the early church. Let's turn to defender of orthodoxy. Gregory not only yearned to advance the Christian faith in distant places, but took seriously his call as a defender of orthodoxy, meaning correct theology. His teachers in the faith were Ambrose, Augustine of Hippo, and Jerome, but he lacked their intellectual abilities. While he continued, while he contributed no new ideas or theological movement, he formulated the common faith of his day and handed it on to the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. In his doctrine of man or humanity, Gregory stressed that Adam's fall affected his descendants, weakening but not destroying their freedom of will. Thus, once someone has been moved by grace, he or she may cooperate with it and win merit by good works, the joint product of divine grace and human will. In baptism, God grants forgiving grace freely without any merit on a person's part, but for sins committed after baptism, a person must make atonement by penance, a form of punishment inflicted by oneself instead of by God. Penance requires sincere repentance, as well as confession of sin and meritorious works, deeds involving sacrifice or suffering, such as giving alms, ascetic practices, and prayers at all hours of the day. The greater one's sins, the more that must be done to make up for them. Whether a person has done enough cannot be known until after death. According to Gregory, sinners have the help of the saints. While he did not originate belief in the intercession of the saints and the custom of appealing to them to use their influence with Christ, his emphasis made them central for Christian spirituality. Another aid to devotion was the holy relics. Gregory encouraged the collection and veneration or adoration of holy remains of the saints and martyrs, such as locks of hair, fingernails, or pieces of clothing. teaching that these items possess great powers. And he further taught that sins could still be atoned in purgatory. Purgatory is, in Catholic belief, a place of purification and suffering for those who are not altogether righteous but have not committed serious offenses that would condemn them to an eternity in hell. He further upheld that the Holy Eucharist or Lord's Supper was the supreme miracle, the key to all the other expressions of divine power. According to Gregory, the Eucharist is a communion with Christ, whose body and blood are present in the bread and wine, which we feed upon to nourish our spiritual lives. The marvelous power of the Eucharist is in its sacrificial character, as it is offered for the sins of those gathered. For these, it has the same effect as penance, and it may also benefit the dead in purgatory by speeding the time of release. In his writing, Gregory tells the story of the death of a monk who had been severely punished after being found guilty of hoarding money. Feeling compassion for the deceased monk, who must be suffering in purgatory, Gregory instructed the prior, meaning the leader of a religious order, to celebrate the Eucharist or Mass every day for 30 days for the monk's release. At the end of the 30 days, a fellow monk had a vision of the deceased monk's spirit, reporting that he was now freed from the suffering of purgatory and admitted to communion in heaven. This teaching regarding the Eucharist was widely accepted in the Western Church from Gregory's time and proved an important element of the Christianity of the Middle Ages. All right, now we move on to chapter 19, the search for unity, which is about Charlemagne and Christendom. On April 25th, 799, Pope Leo III was leading a procession through Rome for God's blessing upon the fields and their harvest after the people had been afflicted with accidents and severe crop damage. The procession led through the middle of the city to St. Peter's Basilica. During the procession, armed men rushed at the Pope, drove off his attendants, and took him away to a Greek monastery. This was a mutiny led by ranking officials and dignitaries loyal to the previous Pope, Adrian I. They charged Leo with perjury and adultery. However, the Pope's supporters used the cover of darkness to rescue him and bring him back to St. Peter's. However, continued fighting convinced Leo of the need for outside help, and he appealed to the traditional protector of the papacy at that time, the king of the Franks, who was Charles the Great. The next year, Charles crossed the Alps with an army prepared to settle the Pope's problem once and for all. In December, the king presided over a large assembly of bishops, nobles, diplomats, members of the royal household, and rebels. The Pope took an oath, purging himself of the accusations against him. Then, on Christmas Day, Charles came to St. Peter's with a large company for worship. As Leo sang, Charles prayed on his knees. The Pope then approached him with a golden crown, placing it on his head and bowing as the people cried that Charles was crowned by God as emperor, restoring the Christian Roman Empire. In the Middle Ages, the modern ideas of autonomous sovereign states without religious affiliation and of the church as a voluntary association apart from the rest of organized society did not exist. Drawing on Augustine's vision of the city of God, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, Charlemagne actually means Charles the Great, he implanted the Christian concept of a universal church into the traditional Roman view of empire. giving to the medieval world Christendom, a unified society mixing religious concerns with earthly affairs. In other words, a complete joining of church and state. Due to the persistence of an idea and the rise of a powerful kingdom, the church became, to a large extent, part of worldly power. Let's turn to ideas die slowly. Centuries after its fall to barbarism, the Roman Empire in the West continued its sway over the imaginations of both leaders and followers. As the barbarians had many kingdoms, often at war with each other, many still longed for the unity that had once marked the empire, and they looked for the day when a new Roman emperor or new Roman Empire would appear. In the blending of Roman and Germanic peoples and cultures, the Franks rose above the others and seemed destined to restore the imperial authority. With the support of the Catholic Church, Clovis had made the kingdom of Franks a dominant power among the German tribes. After his death, however, his dynasty began to decay from inner weakness. The Germanic practice of dividing a kingdom among the king's sons resulted in constant civil war, and royal heirs often engaged in murder, intrigue, and treachery. At the same time, a new center of power arose from the aristocrats, who gained more authority. One powerful landowner emerged as the most influential figure in the kingdom, called the mayor of the palace. A new era for the kingdom of the Franks began in 714 when Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, became mayor of the palace. While he allowed the Merovingian kings to retain their claim to the throne, they were seen as figureheads, uh, while the mayor of the palace had the real power. Victory over the Muslim invaders of Europe earned Charles the name Martel, or the Hammer. In 711, a Muslim army from North Africa had invaded Spain, and by 718, the weak kingdom of the Visigoths had collapsed. When the Muslims began making raid across the Pyrenees Mountains, Charles Martel met them in the Frankish kingdom and inflicted heavy losses on them. They retreated towards Spain and were never again a major threat to Central Europe. So I've heard that because of it is largely because of Charles Martel and this, maybe even the specific battle that saved Europe from being conquered by the Muslim forces, and that is why Europe historically is Christian and did not become the kingdoms did not become Muslim, all because of Charles Martel and his victory in this battle. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, was a worthy successor to his father. However, he sought to legalize the regal power exercised by the mayors of the palace and turned to the Pope for a ruling that whoever had the actual power should be the legal ruler. In 751, Boniface crowned Pepin king of the Franks, and the last Merovingian ruler was quietly removed. 3 years later, the Pope personally anointed Pepin as the Lord's chosen. The Pope's action was likely due to his need for a powerful protector, since the Lombards had conquered the imperial territory at Ravenna, the seat of Byzantine government in Italy, and were demanding tribute from the Pope and threatening Rome. Following Pepin's coronation, the Pope gained his promise of armed intervention in Italy and his pledge to give the papacy the territory of Ravenna once it was conquered. In 756, a Frankish army forced the Lombard king to surrender his conquests, and Pepin kept his promise to give the Ravenna territory to the Pope, making the Pope ruler over a strip of territory known as the Papal States. This alliance between the Franks and the papacy affected the course of European politics and Christianity for centuries. It accelerated the separation of the Latin Church from the Greek by providing the papacy with a dependable Western ally in place of the Byzantine rulers. It created the Papal States, which played a major role in Italian politics until the late 19th century. It further provided Western kingship with a religious sanction that would eventually contribute to the rivalry between Pope and Emperor. With the rise to power of Pepin's son, Charles, known today as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, the final step was taken to restore the Christian empire to the West. When Charles succeeded his father in 768, his mind was set on three goals: military power to crush his enemies, religious power to direct his people's souls, and intellectual power to instruct souls and minds. His success in these areas made the new political order of Europe nominally Christian, meaning Christian at least in name, for 1,000 years. Let's turn to architect of an empire. In addition to being a successful warrior king, leading his armies on yearly campaigns, Charlemagne also sought to provide an effective administration for his realm. Four areas were successfully added to his kingdom by military might. First was his southern border. Seeking to extend Christendom into Spain, he drove the Muslims back to the Ebro River and established a frontier area known as the Spanish Mark, centered around Barcelona. Second, he conquered Bavarians and Saxons, the last of the independent Germanic tribes. Third, he sought to secure his eastern frontier, which was continually threatened by Asiatic nomadic tribes known as the Slavs and Avars. He decimated the Avars and set up a military province called the East Mark, which later became Austria, to guard against plundering by Eastern nomads. Finally, he also intervened in Italian politics. When the Lombard king again invaded the papal territories, Charlemagne defeated the Lombards and proclaimed himself their king. He also confirmed the donation of Pepin, which secured his family's alliance with the Church of Rome. This movement into Italy was the precursor to the one in 800 that resulted in his coronation as emperor. The Pope needed protection, and Charlemagne needed divine sanction. While Charlemagne claimed not to know his coronation had been planned, he lived up to it, taking seriously his title of Roman Emperor. His coronation ceremony in St. Peter's demonstrated that the memory of the Roman Empire survived as a vital tradition in Europe, and that there was a strong desire to reestablish political unity. However, the coronation also began a long standing struggle between the revived empire and the papacy. In medieval theory, church and state were two aspects of Christendom, the one representing Christian society organized to secure spiritual blessings, the other to safeguard justice and human welfare. Theoretically, church and state were in harmony and worked together, aiming to secure the good of humankind. In fact, however, the Pope and Emperor were contestants, competing over whether the church or state should be in control. The contest was seen in countless areas throughout the Middle Ages. In his lifetime, Charlemagne left no doubts about his sovereignty and his empire, as he proved to be a dominating father figure to Europe. He also created a group of itinerant envoys to supervise local officials. He further fostered a revival of learning and the arts. You can challenge Charlemagne's claim to greatness as a major constructive figure of world history. From the new center in the north, he extended Christian civilization in Europe and restored a measure of law and order after 3 centuries of disorder. And the imperial idea he revived persisted as a political force in Europe until 1806. Let's turn to the decline into feudalism. Unfortunately, the territories of Charlemagne's empire were too vast and its nobility too powerful to be held together after Charlemagne's death. Under his weak successors, the empire disintegrated amid the confusion of civil wars and new invasions. When Vikings from the Northland raided, people surrendered their lands and freedom to the counts, dukes, and other local lords in return for protection. This situation is known as feudalism, a type of government in which political power was exercised locally by private individuals rather than by agents of a centralized state. Central to feudalism was the personal bond between lord and vassal. The vassal promised loyalty to his lord, and the vassal was granted property known as the fief. The feudal contract entered into by lord and vassal was considered sacred and binding on both parties. It was the fundamental bond of early medieval society, and breaking it was considered a felony. The lord was obliged to give his vassal protection and justice, while the vassal's primary duty was military service. The conditions caused by new raiders, Vikings from the north and Magyars from Asia, forced church officials to enter into a feudal relationship with the barons in France and the kings in Germany, the only ones powerful enough to offer them protection. Loyalty to these lords created conflicts for those bishops who looked to the Pope as God's appointed leader of the church. On the positive side, however, the church sought to influence for the better the behavior of the feudal barons. In addition to attempting to add Christian values or Christian virtues to the code of knightly conduct called chivalry, the church tried to impose limitations on feudal warfare. Only after the German king, Otto the Great, revived the Roman Empire in the West in 962 was some sense of unity restored. With the renewal of the empire, however, came the old rivalry between church and state. At first, the papacy looked to the German king for protection against the unruly Italian nobles. Yet the arrangement had disadvantages for the church, for the German kings interfered in church affairs, even in the election of popes. During the 11th century, the controversy between church and state centered on the problem of lay investiture, meaning church officials being appointed by lay people rather than by church leaders. Theoretically, on taking office, a bishop or abbot was subject to 2 investitures. His spiritual authority was bestowed by a church official, and his feudal or civil authority by the king or noble. In fact, however, feudal lords and kings came to control both the appointment and installation of church officials. The practice was most prominent in Germany, where control of the church was the foundation of the king's power. Let's look at setting in order the house of God. The church was unprepared to challenge kings and emperors. It needed to set its own house in spiritual order, which began with a revival within the Reformed Benedictine Order of Cluny, founded in 910. A powerful force from the original monastery in Burgundy called for the reform of the feudalized church. The Cluniac program began as a movement for monastic reform. The ultimate goal of the reformers was to free the entire church from secular control and subject it to papal authority. In 1059, the papacy was removed from secular interference by the creation of the College of Cardinals, which afterward elected the popes. The reform of the papacy was led by an archdeacon named Hildebrand. He was elected pope in 1073 as Gregory VII, and he claimed unprecedented power for the pope, holding as his ideal the creation of a Christian commonwealth under papal control. Instead of conceding equality between the church and state, he also insisted that the spiritual power was supreme over the temporal. In 1075, he formally prohibited lay investiture and threatened to excommunicate or ban from the church anyone who practiced it. Since most of Europe's rulers engaged in this practice, this led to conflict. The climax of the struggle occurred in Gregory's clash with Emperor Henry IV. The Pope accused Henry of simony, the practice or the purchase of or sale of church office, and lay investiture, and appointing his own choice to be the Archbishop of Milan. Gregory summoned Henry to Rome to explain his conduct. Henry responded by convening a synod of German bishops that declared Gregory was a usurper and unfit to be pope, renouncing obedience to him. In retaliation, Gregory excommunicated and deposed Henry, absolving his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. Driven to make peace with the Pope by a revolt among the German nobles, Henry appeared before Gregory in January 1077 at Canossa, a castle in the mountains of Italy. Dressed as a penitent, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days and begged forgiveness until Gregory restored him into the church. The dramatic humiliation of the emperor did not resolve the conflict, given that public penance was common in those days, even for kings. Yet the Pope had made progress toward freeing the church from interference by lay people and toward increasing the power and prestige of the papacy. At the Concordat of Worms in 1122, Worms is the name of a city in Germany, by the way, a compromise to the lay investiture conflict was reached in which the church maintained the right to elect people to church offices, but only in the presence of the emperor or his representative. So the emperor would still have at least some influence, as you would see. Later popes, like Gregory, insisted that Christian society was organized under the Pope, its visible head, and he was guarded against all possibility of error by the presence of Peter perpetually and his successors, the bishops of Rome. While many of Gregory's claims now appear intolerable, we must agree that Gregory and his successors stood for two principles that Christians see as undeniable. Spiritual loyalty has primacy over secular loyalty, and the families of men and women can find true unity only in Christ and in obedience to the law of God. During the Middle Ages, Europe became conscious of itself as a unity, and the church attained a level of power and influence over people's lives, which, for the most part, it used helpfully, that it has never had since that time. All right. That will conclude our lecture. The primary text for this week is from Gregory's book 11, letter 65, the scheme of organization for the English church. So you can find that online. And I've copied it into the notes here. So we'll scroll through this shortly. But again, if you would like to, or I'll try to scroll through it slowly, but again, if you'd like to have a copy of these notes, just let me know and I'll send them to you. Uh, okay. And for the attendance assignments, please write 1 to 2 paragraphs to answer the following question and keep it to no more than 1 page. What is one main idea you learned from today's lesson? Right. Um, and if you want to do the extra credit assignments, briefly describe in your own words what you learned about Gregory's plan for the organization of the English Church from his book 11, letter 65, that we just scrolled through, or that you can also find online. Okay, so that concludes our lesson for this week, and hope you all are doing well. And again, remember, next week we do not have an actual class session. You should not get an email from the school for next week. Uh, and if you do, again, if you do want to go to the church field trip this week, let me know, and I can send you the address of the church. But it's very close to the school, about 2 miles away, just north of the 101 freeway. And the service starts at 10 o'clock. So I will plan on going, and I have at least one friend that's going to go, but it'll be nice to see some of you there as well. Uh, if any of you need a ride, by the way, I could probably pick up maybe 1 or 2 people. Just let me know. Maybe even 3 people, or we could arrange carpools. So if any of you, don't let that stop you if you do need a ride. Uh, but you do get some extra points for doing that, which could improve your grade if your grade is not doing so well. And again, if you want to know your midterm score, let me know in the email, and I will try to get those graded so I can be able to give that grade to you within the next week or so. All right, so we have 2 more lectures and then a final exam. Hope you are enjoying this class and learning a lot. Take care. We'll see you next week or in 2 weeks.